You ready?
Yeah.
Okay. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. Very excited to have as my guest today, Dr. Amy King. Amy, welcome.
Hi, Guy. I'm so happy to be here.
All right. So Dr. King is a licensed psychologist with a private practice. She provides training, consultation, and education. Among her specialties is working with professionals to help create resilient children and thriving families, guiding them to heal their stress and trauma through connected relationships. Her experience includes serving as a statewide trainer for the Oregon Department of Human Services and subject matter expert to promote child wellness in pediatric settings on behalf of the Children's Health Alliance. Her current work is promoting resilience within primary care medical homes through partnership and collaboration. When she's not working to promote resilience, you can find her with her family on their small hobby farm in Newberg, Oregon. What is a hobby? Hobby farm as in professional farm? As opposed
Hobby,
to
as in like it's just my hobby. I wish I was a farmer. I wish I could say I was a farmer, but I'm not a farmer.
Awesome, awesome. All right, before we go in here, share with our listeners where you're from originally and then where you are currently.
So I'm originally from the Midwest, from the great state of Iowa. And then I traveled to Omaha, Nebraska for my undergraduate degree at Creighton, and then to Indiana for my doctorate, and then out here for my residency. And I landed in Portland, Oregon in 2002, fell in love with the Pacific Northwest, and have been here ever since.
Awesome, awesome. So look, have you're a very interesting person, and you've put together a very interesting what business. What you do is very interesting. There are a lot of facets to it. I want to know how the heck you got into do what you're doing. What drew you initially into psychology?
Yeah. So interestingly, I was actually pre-medicine at Creighton, and my aspirations were to be a physician and maybe a pediatrician, maybe an OBGYN. I wasn't sure. I knew I wanted to have long-term relationships with people. So I decided I would major in psychology as a way to have really good bedside manner and understand how people think and learn. And about halfway through my junior year, in my undergrad, I realized, this psychology thing's pretty interesting, and how people think and how they behave. And I approached my advisor and I said, what's the long-term degree in psychology? Like, can one have a doctorate in psychology? Right? And I had this kind of big identity crisis that I loved psychology more than I maybe loved medicine, and wrangled with that. And then took a master's class, my senior thesis on stress and coping, and fell in love with it and had the opportunity to shadow incredible psychologists in the field. And I just, that was it. I was done. I applied to graduate school and decided that was the field I wanted to go into.
What you said you fell in love with it, that particular class. What was it about that you fell in love with?
Understanding that our bodies have we absorb stress and trauma that occur in our life, and B, we have this incredible ability through experience, through learning, through community, through relationship, to recover from it as well. And when I realized that, like, you can have these big crises happen in your life and there are some ameliorating factors, I wanted to be part of that, and I wanted to be part of it early. So I really did decide also at the time that I wanted to focus on early childhood and pediatric health and child and family issues versus adult psychology.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned the identity shift, the identity crisis in a sense from physician. I know what that's like because I went into pre-med, but I got my ass kicked. But and it is very different. And yes, there are exceptions to the rule, and I've had a lot of them on the individuals on this podcast. But for you, what was the driving force for you to want to be a doctor?
To be a physician at
Yeah,
first. I
yeah.
mean, so I grew up really poor, Guy. I grew up pretty poor in Iowa, and supported myself really financially since the time I was about 14. And so when you grow up without money, you figure out like what are some careers that could make money. And at the time, and physicians may laugh at this now, given the amount of debt they have and all the things, what medicine looks like today. But I thought like I could become a physician. That seems like a clear path to making money, but also to helping people. And I really wanted to help people. I really wanted to help people and heal people. So it was like, how do I make money and help and heal people? Okay, well, I'll go into medicine. And then the more I learned about psychology, the more I realized I can still have an incredible living and help and heal people in a much, much deeper way.
Right, right. Cool. All right. So you go into psychology, then you get into graduate school. What were you thinking when you got into graduate school, specifically about what you wanted to do, where you wanted to go?
You know, it's interesting because looking back now, it seems like I had this clear path, but because now the irony is that I train physicians in healthcare organizations, which was my origin, right? But I knew I wanted to work with trauma. I knew I wanted to work with kids. And so I looked into programs that had really strong clinical background in education, in child therapy, in that orientation development. And then I had these incredible mentors along the way who really shaped and guided how I think about people, how I think about trauma, what it looks like, how it's both individual and systemic at the same time. So
Mhm.
I was really, I think, blessed, maybe is a good word, fortunate to have incredible mentors along the way who just kept saying, tell me more, why does this interest you, let's create a path on this. And I ended up carving my own path in my doctoral program that I ended up with an endorsement in both early childhood psychology and pediatric health.
Mhm.
And nobody had done that in my program, but I knew I wanted something, so I would just kind of crafted it, and my advisors were incredible. And that was essentially what my dissertation was on, was factors that help families cope and adjust to having a child with chronic medical conditions.
Wow. Um, is that something we can link to?
The dissertation, well, the
That
biggest
would
thing
be
that
really
came out
cool.
of the dissertation was the circles of support, which I train and teach on regularly now. And it's an intervention that I created as part of my curriculum around resilience building. It's something I learned then. And I would ask families, who are your circles of support? And what I didn't realize then, Guy, that I know now, right, is I was creating this foundation of focusing on the strengths, the resilience, the inherent ability for families to heal themselves when they're given appropriate resources and connections.
Mhm.
And as I was listening and honored to listen to these stories about families, I used this exercise that was originally created for kids with disabilities called the Circle of Friends, and I expanded it to call it the Circle of Support.
Mm.
Um, and asking families, who is in your circle? And it started out with these families who had kids with really complex medical needs. And what we found out is that especially moms could identify many people who were support people for them, and dads could typically identify one, and it was often mom.
Mm.
And so just studying stress and how people cope became a passion of mine, led to my dissertation. And then I sought out a residency that was focused on a lot of community-based mental health and working with kids and families with trauma.
When you got into graduate school, was there this sense that was there strong interest in trauma for you?
For sure, because I had
Okay.
done this senior thesis in my undergraduate around stress and coping. And I think knowing my family of origin, I had experienced trauma growing up, being curious about it, and then being hopeful that there are ways families can heal.
Mhm.
Um, Really led me into this, like, how do we focus early and often with kids and families? My one of my mentors was a co-founder of Head Start, and so I just had a lot of incredible people in my life who were really focused on preventative
Mhm.
and proactive mental health for kids and families.
when I got into graduate school, I knew I wanted to focus on trauma. I didn't fully understand, well, what it was, of course, or how multifaceted it was. I also didn't really understand fully what was pulling me towards that. Um, were you clear on how impactful your family dynamic was on what you were doing, what you wanted to do?
It's a great question. I mean, in psychology, and I know that a lot of your listeners are young therapists and aspiring therapists wanting to learn about trauma, Guy. In psychology, we have this phrase that says research is me search. And we kind of stumble into being curious and finding out about fields of study that really help us heal and understand our backgrounds. So I wouldn't say I was keenly aware. I was awakened maybe and beginning to be aware of how some of the traumas that I had experienced as a child affected my interest in understanding addictions, for instance, understanding family dynamics. But it really wasn't until late into my graduate program and then my residency. My residency was really this um, seminal year of exploration. There's nothing like working 70 hours a week and being sleep deprived, having an entire caseload that's full of trauma to make you, it's either going to break you, I suppose, or it's
Mm-hmm.
going to make you become really self-aware of
Mm-hmm.
like, why is my body so activated? Why am I so triggered all the time? Why can I not watch the news? Why am I tearful? Why am I not sleeping? Um, and I began to, do some therapy and some inner work myself, and which I would recommend to anybody. If you're doing therapy, you should be in therapy. And a lot of programs actually require it. But anyway, it began almost like a must. I have to do some inner work here,
Mm-hmm.
to be able to continue to do the work I'm doing with kids and families and to understand what's mine and what's theirs, right?
Right, right, right. All right, let me just remind everyone I'm speaking with Dr. Amy King. Her website is dramyllc.com. Obviously, we'll have that linked up at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. So, what you do, okay, share with us what you do now and how did you get to there after you got out of graduate school?
Yeah, yeah. So now I still have a private practice. It's very small. I just see kind of previous clients, current clients, obviously, who are just needing some maintenance work. I don't take new clients anymore. But I tend to do a lot of long-term trauma work with people who've either survived childhood trauma or are trying to understand current traumas that they're going through. So that's a very small part, 1 or 2 days a week. And then what I do the rest of the time is I do consultation and training for physicians and to healthcare organizations around what is trauma, what does it look like, how does it present, and then once we can know it and identify it and see it, what do we do about it in a healthcare organization? How can we respond in what we would call a trauma-informed way? But I would just say, how do we respond more compassionately? Once you see it and you know it, you can't unsee it.
Mm-hmm.
And then how can we respond as individuals and organizations with compassion? So when I started doing that work, and you alluded to this in my bio, the Children's Health Alliance had this incredible group of pediatricians that approached me when they heard the Nadine Burke Harris TED Talk on childhood ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. And they reached out to me and they said, hey, you do consultation, you understand peds, you understand trauma. Can you come and consult with us? And so I worked alongside this incredible group of pediatricians. And at one point, this is a wonderful memory for me. I just remember Dr. Mashofsky looking at me, one of these veteran pediatricians, and saying, you know what I really want, Amy? I really want to focus on the resilience piece. Could you create something so that every single well child visit, I'm not just talking about trauma, but I'm doing something about it?
Mm-hmm.
It's like physicians felt it was important to understand trauma and to screen for it. And some physicians do that now and some don't. But even more so, what do I do about it? Like, I can't just know it and then not know what to do about it. And
Right.
so we began this incredible relationship of I was taking trauma informed techniques that you or I might do in a 50-minute session, right? Or a therapist might do, and making it like 2 to 5 minutes for a physician who's stressed with time. And I would just kind of throw things at them, like, what do you think about this? And what if you tried this? And what if and they would come back to me, and they're like, I can't talk about that. I'm not a therapist. Or like, this is really helpful, but I need a script. Or is there a picture that could go along with that? And we just had this dance of
Mm,
try this, see if it works, give me feedback. And we did that for some time. We did trainings for all of the pediatricians and the Children's Health Alliance. And that really launched me into doing more consultation and training, both with physicians around this resilience building piece, that it can happen in well exams, it can happen with kids, it can happen with adults.
mhm.
You don't have to be a trained therapist to do it. And to then provide on a larger scale trainings and consultation to healthcare organizations about what it means to be trauma informed.
Wow, really cool, really inspiring. I have so many questions for you. Number one, um, I'm going to ask you these questions first, and then I'm going to ask you to answer them. But I want to say them so I don't forget them. Number one, how would you define trauma? Number two, what is or was your sense of how physicians understood trauma and even now understand trauma? And you mentioned the fact that that one physician was like, "Well, I'm not a therapist. I can't do that." Talk a little bit about the things that distinguish or differentiate, say, a therapist and a physician. Because what I think is really cool is that in order to do what you do, you've got to certainly be confident, and you've got to own your space as a psychologist and your body of knowledge, and be able to transfer that to other professionals. Anyway,
Right.
so
Right.
so
I mean, like, let's be honest, first of all, right? I mean, physicians can be intimidating. Anybody who's worked with them knows that, because they're trained in a medical model for absolute knowledge. And so, what I have to remind myself of on a daily basis when I interact with physicians is that they know what I know, and they know what they know, and I know what I know. And then there's this beautiful overlap where we can help and teach and train and consult with each other. But I often have to stand in this space of like, I know what I know, right? And I can help. Um, so going back to your question around defining trauma, often what I start with is differentiating, first of all, between acute trauma and complex trauma. And acute trauma are those single episodes that are certainly traumatic, and we don't want to minimize those, but like um, uh, being in a car crash, your house burning down, witnessing a shooting, for instance, those are single event traumas.
mhm,
Most of the time, we know as psychologists, people can recover from those. Cognitive behavioral therapy, exposure and response therapy, right? Often, what I'm training and teaching about is complex trauma. And complex trauma is something that is happening over the course of someone's life with little or no access to resources and support. And I think it's Gabor Mate who says, trauma doesn't become trauma until it's experienced by yourself,
mhm,
right? That we all may go through really difficult events, but it becomes traumatic when we're alone in it.
mhm,
And really, this idea of complex trauma happening over the course of someone's life with little access to resources and support. And then from there, we can broaden the definition of trauma, right, to include historical traumas that are happening in entire groups of people, intergenerational traumas. But I try to just start with what is trauma and what does it look like? So that's kind
mhm,
of the next question that you asked, which is like, how do physicians and healthcare organizations understand trauma? And my comment to that would be, they're not unlike anybody else. They really don't know what trauma is or how it presents in people, right?
mhm,
They've been trained in medicine, or all the people in their clinic or their hospital organization who aren't physicians who are working at the front desk, or they're in the billing and coding department, or they're in administration. When someone comes into a clinic and the front office person presents them with 5 surveys to fill out and billing updates, and you've got this like maybe harried mom who took 2 buses to get to this appointment, and she's running late, and she's got 2 toddlers who are climbing over each other and grumpy because they're hungry, and then she's asked to fill out these forms. That's triggering for her.
Mm-hmm.
And then maybe mom is grumpy with the front office person, or dismissive, or snapping at her kids. And what I see happen is that we begin to judge that
Mm-hmm.
person, or make leaps around what's happening or not happening for that person. It's usually a character thing, right? Like, what's the matter with her? Why is
Right.
she so X, Y, or Z? And what I really want people to step back, whether you're a healthcare provider or anyone, is step back and go, I wonder what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
Most people don't want to come across as angry, aggressive, disinterested, passive, uninvolved in their healthcare, angry with people who are trying. Most people, if they're behaving that way,
Right.
have something else going on.
Right.
So
So
that's kind of the,
curiosity.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Um, And then the third thing you were asking about, barriers to trauma in medicine, this whole idea of like, I'm not a therapist. It's interesting because, as you know, I started a podcast for healthcare providers and physicians. And I've now, I think I'm on my like 8th interview for physicians. And the common theme that they all are saying, which I love hearing,
Mm.
that's helping them with trauma, is to just be quiet and listen. And one of my previous guests, Dr. Weiser, said, ask an open-ended question, sit and be quiet, pass the tissues, and get out of the way.
Pass the tissues and get out of the way.
I was like, I love that. And really, it does come down to listening.
So is that look, I don't want to generalize, right? But is that something that physicians in general aren't taught to do, is just to listen rather, right? I don't know. I'm asking you that
I mean,
question.
they're taught in this medical model to heal and to fix and to have a solution for something. And so if someone comes in for an earache, they prescribe an antibiotic if they have an ear infection. And if someone has arrhythmia, they send them to a cardiologist to get checked out so that that can get fixed for them. When we're asking physicians to ask families about adversity, trauma, early relational health, they're scared at first, or skeptical, like, you're going to ask me to do this and it's going to open up Pandora's box. But in actuality, the patient's trauma doesn't surprise anybody except for the physician, because the patient already knows about it, right? They know what they've experienced. And now, by being asked, you've created this space of acknowledgement, and that's where healing begins.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah,
So,
this is a really interesting topic, because I'm thinking to myself, in a sense, healing really can only happen once that door is opened. And yet, one can argue that walking into this arena is maybe something a lot of physicians didn't think they were going to have to get into.
yeah. Yeah, and I have a really great friend and colleague, RJ Gillespie, who has done a little bit of research with his own clinic, where he goes back retrospectively and asks them, like, was it as bad as you thought? The answer is no. Did it take up more time than you thought? The answer is no, right? And often people don't even want to talk more about it. They just are touched to be
Right.
asked.
Yeah.
And if you remember, like, physicians have this opportunity, unlike anybody else, to have a relationship with someone over the course of their lifetime, potentially.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're just making little seeds of saying, I'm a
Mm-hmm.
safe person in your world. So that the next time they come in and maybe there is a hardship, there's domestic violence or addiction or a loss, or that they've already laid the groundwork by saying, I want to know things that are happening in your life.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And when you can kind of speak to physicians training, like, they are trained in a biopsychosocial model. But often what happens is they focus on the bio part so
Mm-hmm.
much because they have to, that's what's presenting.
Right.
And often there are these other things that are actually creating manifestations in the biology that are social and emotional.
Mm-hmm. Well, so are you looking at your website again, which is dramyllc.com. Um, do you offer workshops for other therapists or just for physicians?
So I have a membership called the Provider Lounge that is created for primary care doctors, but there's also an opportunity for behavioral health consultants to meet regularly within that membership. So I don't provide workshops necessarily unless so I do trainings for organizations and I'm often asked to come in and talk about trauma.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, yes, I come in and I do trainings often with therapists or therapists that are working in healthcare settings. But in terms of regular offerings, my regular offerings are my Provider Lounge membership. And then once a year, I run a retreat at my farm. And it's a beautiful intersection of people who want to learn about trauma.
Wow.
I have physicians, I have nurse practitioners, I have therapists, I have LCSWs, a whole variety. And the the diversity makes it a really fun learning experience.
And the next retreat, spring 2023,
Yep. Yep.
dates to be announced. Okay, we'll have that linked up again at the show notes page here. So you started a podcast. Congratulations on that. And that's called The Most Important Medicine. Tell us about that. Why did you start the podcast?
So, so many people had been encouraging me to do a podcast for a long time because I love talking to people like this. I think I make talking about trauma pretty accessible and not so scary. And my passion is that I want every single person who's interacting in the life of a child or a patient to know what trauma is and know what to do about it. And a podcast became this very clear way of like disseminating information freely to the masses in a way that could be really intentional for me.
Mm-hmm.
And so, shout out to you. I took your workshop on podcasting and it wasn't as intimidating as I thought. And
Did
I
you
pull
think it
out
was
my
going to be
hair.
intimidating?
Oh, for sure. Like I'm not a super techie person. And I did
Right.
pull out my hair a little bit with GarageBand and then I was fine. And now it's just like it's just happening, right? So but the title is probably like what I'm the most proud of. And it came out of our last retreat where I was talking to all of these people around what trauma is and what do we do about it. And this incredible young pediatrician who actually did his fellowship in trauma with that theme. He raised his hand. He's like, I think the previous title of the retreat was something like building resilience and buffering mechanisms in healthcare or something like that, right? And he said, Amy, this is everything. Like what you're talking about is everything. This is the most important medicine that we should all be learning about.
Mm.
And I was like, thank you. And it really is like every time now I have this opportunity to talk with physicians and healthcare providers about trauma and creating resilience. What I hear from them after their skepticism wanes and they feel more comfortable is I'll never get better at treating asthma or treating an ear infection or managing diabetes, but this is changing my practice. This
Wow.
is changing how I connect with my patients, how I think about them, what I ask. It's been probably the greatest honor, and it's full circle for me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wow. Amy, that is amazing. I mean, you're so inspiring. I'm just listening to you and thinking how you've taken your experiences and your education and your identity crisis and created this or to how it served to fuel your passion. It's
Yeah,
really cool.
thank you. I'm loving it.
It's really awesome. All right. As we kind of wind down here, share with our listeners the best place to reach out to you.
The best place is to go to my website, dramyllc.com. You can subscribe to my newsletter. That's where I put out all the information about any upcoming workshops. I send out a weekly blog on trauma, what it means to be trauma informed. I give free workshops all the time, but that's the best way to learn about all those. And then I'm on social media, Dr. Amy LLC, on Instagram and Facebook. But those, yeah, if you just go to my website, you'll find all the good links.
Okay. And the podcast again is The Most Important Medicine, and people can get that where? Anywhere?
Anywhere they're listening to podcasts, Spotify, Apple, Google.
Okay. So one thing I want to touch upon, there are obviously a lot of therapists listening to this, but I bet there are a lot of them listening to you saying, wow, that is so cool how she's taken her education and done this with it.
Mhm.
You're not simply just seeing clients, you're doing these other things with it. What would you say to people listening out there who maybe are like, I want to do something like that too?
Find somebody who's doing what you love to do and ask them to mentor you.
Okay.
That's it.
You're gonna get a lot of emails.
We'll have to start a group, a subgroup of people who want to do this work.
All right, Amy. Awesome. I'd love to have you back. Keep up this conversation, but thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, thanks for having me, and thank you for everything you put into the world. It's really phenomenal.
I appreciate that. All right, we'll be in touch.
Thanks.